Hi, I'm Michael Shannon, and in this course, I'll describe the present threat landscape, threat actors, and their attributes. Let's take a broad look at the threat landscape. There's no doubt about it. There's plenty of fear, uncertainty, and doubt out there when it comes to network security and information security. There's no shortage of news about individuals, public and private organizations, government agencies falling victim to an array of malware attacks. For example, a zero-day attack, which we'll learn more about, on public utilities, ransomware on large hospitals or law enforcement agencies, pictures stolen from a celebrity's cell phone. The list goes on. And to top it off, because of the Internet of Things, IoT, where eventually every entity will have an IPv6 address, the dangers are just not going away. I just saw a commercial today, I think it was for AT&T, where a farmer had his irrigation system completely mechanized and digitized, and he was controlling his watering system using his cell phone. Just think about that getting hacked. Elevators can be hacked. Medical devices that are human connected. We're going to see a huge growth of wearable IT, so that elderly people in a nursing home or in some other facility, or maybe even in their own home, are wearing technological devices, shirts, pants, other types of clothing that actually are sending information back to a doctor or a hospital. So IoT means this risk will not subside. And organized crime and state-based hacking teams are more devious and clever than ever, and have vast resources and funding, as well as plenty of time and patience, if the payoff from the APT, the Advanced Persistent Threat, is going to be profitable. Recent surveys show that less than 50% of users that are on the internet are using paid internet security. So what that means is the other half are not using any security at all, or they're using some freeware or shareware that's probably not being updated regularly from the cloud. As a threat defense practitioner, we have to be flexible and knowledgeable and not governed by preconceptions on the behavior of known network threats, because these things are changing on a regular basis. Attackers are very creative and persistent and will combine old and new techniques to generate new exploits. Toolkits and script kiddie modules are easy to obtain and easy to learn after watching a few YouTube videos. And this is all readily available on the deep web using a Tor, the Onion Router browser. Kali Linux can be easily installed into a VM on an employee system, and it can run a variety of tools against wired and wireless networks. Prevalent and powerful exploit kits, EKs, like RigEK, Neutrino, Magnitude, Sundown, and Hunter are out there and readily available, just to name a few. And traditional firewalls, IDS, IPS, proxies, application layer gateways, and IP address-based access controls, ACLs, are proving to be inadequate. We need more. And that's what Security Plus from CompTIA is all about. In this video, you got a brief overview of the threat landscape. It's time to talk about risks and vulnerabilities as we look at our terminology of security. Now, keep in mind that when you're taking exams, let's say Security Plus for CompTIA, or the ISC Squared's SSCP, which are very comparable, or even maybe CCNA security from Cisco, a lot of these terms, these industry terms and definitions, they've kind of been standardized, and everybody kind of falls upon the same definitions. So from an exam standpoint, we want to make sure that we understand the definition that they're going to be looking for. However, in the real world, it may be a little bit different. For example, let's look at this term risk. The official definition of risk is the probability that a particular threat using a specific exploit will take advantage of a specific vulnerability. That's a good definition. But personally for me, in my risk analysis, in my risk assessment, I like to use OpenFAIR, FAIR, the Factor Analysis Information Risk. And their definition I kind of like a little bit better. So from the real world standpoint, when we're talking about risk, whether it's information risk or investment risk or credit risk, this is a better term. Risk is the probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. You see, what we're adding here is two variables. How often it happens, okay? How often is the loss likely to happen, and how much loss, magnitude, is likely to result. And believe me, when you're sitting down talking to CEOs and CSOs and CIOs, this is really what they want to know. Information security related risks are ones that arise from the loss of the security triad: confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information or information systems. This is CIA. As a security practitioner, we have to consider the potential adverse impacts on organizational operations, on assets, individuals, other organizations like our strategic partners, customers and vendors, and even our countries. Let's talk more about this security triad. The goal of the security triad is to provide adequate protection of network resources, and of course not just network resources, but of course that's our main focus here in Security Plus. Our procedures, our technologies, they have to guarantee to a high degree confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. Confidentiality is using techniques to permit only authorized users the ability to view sensitive information. Integrity is implementing controls that make certain only authorized subjects can change sensitive information, which might also include affirming the identity of a communication peer. And then system and data availability, offering uninterrupted access by authorized users to important computing resources and data in transit and data at rest. It's these areas of integrity and system and data availability that we're starting to see more emphasis from a security standpoint. Another term we need to define, and it's often a arguable term, is a vulnerability. What is exactly a vulnerability? As we look at this picture here, we can see this chain, this large chain with a link that's actually being stretched. So we see this as kind of a weakness in this chain. So it's a weakness in a system or its design that can be exploited by a threat. Now, I've mentioned threats several times, and a good definition of a threat is this one. It's anything, a human, an object, or a substance that can act in a manner that can result in harm. For example, a hurricane, a drunk driver, or a hacker. The key thing to remember is that threats are the agents or the actors that exploit the vulnerability or the weakness. And one thing that'll help you going forward is to always look at vulnerabilities as a value. In other words, what is it going to cost that organization or that business if that vulnerability is exploited? And the challenge is that vulnerabilities are often inherent in the protocols themselves. For example, TCP/IP and DHCP and HTTP are all protocols that are used to enhance and encourage interoperability and host-to-host communication over internetworks. Well, there's just inherent weaknesses built into those protocols, and we have to overcome and mitigate those weaknesses using other methods outside of the protocols and their standard behaviors. Often the vulnerabilities are located in operating systems and applications, and many times we have really no control over that. We aren't writing the operating system. We aren't developing the applications. And the primary vulnerability of all is human error and the lack of security awareness. You can classify vulnerabilities, and again, we want to put a value on these, but really a vulnerability is human error at the top of the list. Weaknesses in protocols, design errors, having no policy, no security policy, or having policy flaws. They can be software vulnerabilities, misconfiguration of security devices and infrastructure devices, servers, endpoints. It can be malicious code or an overall lack of oversight. Again, as I said, defining risk and vulnerabilities and threats is actually kind of a debatable thing, but we want to stick to the definitions that you would see in a Security Plus or an SSCP type exam. One of the first things that we're going to do as it relates to risk and vulnerability and threats is to do analysis. And this is going to involve asset valuation. What's the monetary value of your physical assets, your fungible assets, and even logical and intangible assets? And that can be a difficult thing to do. We can do it qualitatively in the sense of what is the value in relation to other assets, or the better way to do it is quantitatively, by actually having a hard number assigned to it. As you work with companies, CEOs and boards of directors, committees, they're going to want hard numbers. That's why I like to use open, fair, factor analysis information risk. There's security assessments. We can use tools and methodologies to go in and look at the posture of the organization. We can do penetration testing, trying to find holes in their firewall, trying to find weaknesses in their wireless networking deployment. We can do risk assessments. A broader risk assessment process would be identifying issues that contribute to risk, analyzing the significance of those issues, identifying options for dealing with the risk issue itself, and trying to best find out which option is likely going to be the best fit, and then communicating those results and findings to the decision makers, or the C-suite, CEOs, CIOs, CSOs. And do security testing of their in-house development and evaluate their programmers and application developers. You just learned about risks and vulnerabilities. Threats and threat agents. Threats is anything capable of acting against the assurance and trustworthiness of information systems, system components, services, all types of assets. Now, whether these systems are, for example, an air traffic control system or a nuclear power plant, a financial institution, or a healthcare facility, the systems have to be reliable and trustworthy and resilient in the face of these threats. At the top of the list, we have human errors. They could either be accidental or they could be intentional or unintentional. Hostile cyber attacks, advanced persistent threats from threat actors, cognitive threats via social networking. Now remember, social networking itself is not a threat. It's not even really a vulnerability. There has to be a weakness in the social network to be a vulnerability. There has to be an actual cognitive or threat actor acting against something like Facebook or LinkedIn to be categorized as a threat. In other words, there's usually a person or persons behind the threat, exploiting consumer electronics of all types, interfering with critical infrastructure, SCADA, and the programmable logic controllers at utilities, military services, electrical systems, power plants. And of course, there's natural disasters and structural failures. All of your threats won't be caused by human beings. They could be acts of nature, like a tornado or a flood. Environmental disruptions, obvious hacking into hardware and firmware, exploiting virtual environments and cloud services, introducing tools that will scrape memory and exfil or exfiltrate information to a server on the deep web or the dark web, exploiting protocols like IP version 4 and IP version 6 with denial of service attacks. And there's always the emerging and unknown threat in the form of the 0 day that we have to constantly be aware of. So more importantly is not so much the threat, but the threat agent or the threat actor behind it. Threat agents or threat actors are the persons, methods, operations, techniques, systems, or entities that act or have the potential to act in order to initiate, transport, carry out, or in any way support a particular threat or exploit. In this video, you learned about threats and threat agents. Countermeasures and mitigation. Well, after you've classified and accounted for assets and vulnerabilities, threats are the most important component to understand. This is the thing we're going to spend money on and resources and time to counteract threat actors and threat agents. Once the threat vectors are considered, organizations rely on various controls to accomplish layered security as part of their security architecture. The key thing here, though, is getting the most bang for your buck. As we say in Texas, you don't put a $100 fence around a $10 horse. We need to make commercially reasonable actions. In other words, don't spend more money on the controls than the asset is worth. We want to help organizations look at countermeasures and mitigation as an investment, not a business cost. Security capabilities are typically defined by bringing together a specific set of safeguards or countermeasures, and we call these security controls, and they're derived from the appropriately tailored baselines that together produce the needed capability. Our first type of control is administrative controls. These largely consist of policies and procedures, for instance, security awareness training, written security policies and standards, change and configuration controls, security audits and testing, background checks of contractors and employees, and so on. These are also called managerial controls. Technical controls are the ones that involve electronics and hardware and software and so on. For example, this is the deployment of our firewall system, intrusion prevention systems, the sensors, the VPN gateways, access controls, content security like web security appliances and email security appliances, as well as biometrics. And then physical controls. These are mostly mechanical, or they protect the physical infrastructure. For example, tall fencing around your campus perimeter, maybe a security guard at the entry to your facility, UPSs, fire suppression systems, positive airflow systems, locks, and other protection mechanisms. We can also categorize our mitigation or our controls based on their functionality. For example, we can have preventative controls. These are aimed at preventing or stopping the threat from coming in contact with the vulnerability. In order for a control to be effective or even relevant, we must introduce a difficulty factor. We must make the threat agent's job more difficult. Or, look at it this way, make it easier on the human factor to provide a secure environment with security awareness training. Preventative controls could be physical locks, firewalls, and security policies. So as we look at these different categories, there's going to be overlap in the sense that they can be technical, administrative, and/or physical. Detective controls identify that the threats enter the network or the system. For example, log monitoring, global correlation with the cloud, next-generation intrusion prevention systems, and surveillance cameras. A corrective control is aimed at mitigating or lessening the effects of the threat that's manifested. So, doing a virus cleaning procedure, or incident handling, updating your IP signature database after a worm outbreak. Corrective controls should contribute to continual improvement. A recovery control is aimed at putting a system back into production after an incident. This is where the disaster recovery, the business continuity planning, business impact analysis, and disaster recovery planning comes into play. A recovery control could also be an aspect of a database system that recovers a transaction. A deterrent control is aimed at discouraging security violations. There's often some overlap between preventative and deterrent. But to be specific, deterrent would be signage, for example, keep out, or stickers on windows. Or maybe just the mere presence of controls, such as a surveillance camera or an armed guard, could be a deterrent control. In this video, you learned about mitigation and countermeasures, specifically different types and categories of controls. Let's explore a very important term known as indicators of compromise, or IOCs. It's important to realize that an IOC is not a threat or a vulnerability. It's actually the evidence of some action by a threat agent or a threat actor. An IOC is a forensic artifact of an incursion or a disturbance. It's a measurable event or a stateful property, and it can be network-based and/or host-based. It's also called a cyber observable, a measurable event in the cyber domain. IOCs provide organizations with valuable information on objects or information systems that may have been compromised. For the discovery of compromised hosts, IOCs can include events such as the creation of registry key values, or the modification of those values, or unknown file types on systems. IOCs for network traffic would include URLs or protocol elements that indicate malware command and control servers, part of a DDoS attack or a botnet. The rapid distribution and adoption of IOCs over the cloud can improve security by reducing the time that organizations are vulnerable to the same exploit or the same attack. To discover indicators of compromise, you want to use network-based and host-based analysis. There's many tools available, like next-generation IPS, SIEM, security information and event management systems, NetFlow collectors, and data mining tools. There's the Open IOC framework, and proprietary solutions like the Cisco Fire Site Management Center. In this video, you learned about indicators of compromise, or IOCs. In the early days of hacking, the term script kiddie was actually kind of a derogatory term. It was something that the true cracker or hacker would use to describe somebody who is kind of a novice, kind of a newbie, and kind of standing on the shoulders of giants by using somebody else's prepackaged code or modular exploit to launch attacks. It originates from the combination of inexperienced crackers using script viruses and prepackaged malicious code. But nowadays, the script kiddies are actually big business. They're the customers of a new nefarious type of cloud service. Maybe you've heard of software as a service, SaaS, infrastructure as a service. Well, now these script kiddies can go into the dark web and take advantage of malware as a service or cybercrime as a service. They can just go get on-demand DDoS and download it. There's 0 days that they can purchase. They're taking advantage of bulletproof malware hosting in the dark web to buy these prepackaged exploits. In other words, we've now come to a time where we've commoditized 0-day attacks and malware and made it big business. So script kiddies are no longer made fun of, they're big customers. The most common script viruses are spread through email attachments. Using phishing and spear phishing attacks, they use scripts and modules from exploit kits. They can learn these techniques on YouTube and other social media sites. Many, but not all, script kiddies are hacktivists. Or let's put it this way, not all hacktivists are script kiddies, but a lot of them are. Hacktivism unofficially began in the late 1980s when viruses and worms spread messages of protest. For example, WANK, Worms Against Nuclear Killers. The term hacktivism was coined by another famous hacker group called Cult of the Dead Cow, CDC, notorious for their denial of service and DDoS attacks. It also gave birth to Hacktivismo, a group of international crackers protesting human rights abuses. They're responsible for DOS attacks, DDoS, hijacking, defacing of websites, and other cyber attacks. Today, there's many groups worldwide affiliated with every cause imaginable, although most don't call themselves hacktivists. Some associate with a particular country, or a government, or an entity, or a cause, while others express no particular allegiance, for example, the famous Anonymous. The term hacktivism is commonly used by the media and cybersecurity companies attempting to categorize different types of threat agents and threat actors. In this video, you learned about script kiddies and hacktivists. Let's talk organized crime. Attackers are not limited to just rogue individual script kiddies or even small teams of hackers. Organized crime is often implicated in many attacks. These attackers are remarkably shrewd and tricky, and they have huge supporting funds and human resources. And no industry or business sector is actually exempt from the threat of organized crime. Now, does that mean it's highly likely that some Eastern European mafia is going to go after your small to medium-sized business? That's pretty low probability. But crime can be organized by just a half a dozen to a dozen people with readily available tools and toolkits obtained through a Tor browser on the deep web, the dark web. What types of crime are they involved with? Well, it's not just, launching malware attacks. We're looking at taking the things that they steal, and they're also performing money laundering. They're doing unlawful banking transactions. There's black market drugs on dark nets behind those Tor browsers. Remember the Silk Road? They do identity theft, credit card fraud, tax fraud. Just this week I talked to a lady who filed her taxes last year, and the IRS came back and said, hey, you already filed your taxes. Somebody had stolen her identity. There's bullet board systems that have unlawful activity, illegal bookmaking, counterfeiting of software and music and videos and movies, copyright violations, theft of technology, and even state secrets. Speaking of states, Many people think that we're actually in the Third World War now. It's not World War III, it's World War C, cyber war, involving many of the same activities as the criminal syndicates: cyber warfare, espionage, and blackmail. There's zero-day code sitting on systems in pretty much every country placed by different countries. A lot of it being what we call logic bombs, just waiting for a certain time or a certain event to go off. Distributed DOS attacks are of the greatest concern today for government agencies and industries. As we can see here from this table from hackmageddon.com, this is February 2017, showing that 64.5% of the motivations behind attacks is actually cybercrime, and cyber espionage adds 22.4% to the equation. APTs, or advanced persistent threats, are kind of a description of the types of campaigns that these organized criminals and state-based hacker groups can do, including hacktivists as well. An advanced persistent threat is exactly what it is. It's planned in advance, to be executed in advance, often weeks, months, or even years ahead of time. It's persistent, which means they're going to keep trying over and over and over again. They'll do reconnaissance attacks repeatedly. They'll try to penetrate your firewall repeatedly. They're going to use bleeding edge, stealth malware, polymorphic packing malware, and 0 days. They'll perform financial cost-benefit analysis to find out if the company they want to hack is going to be worth the payoff in the credit cards that they're going to steal, or the information they can use for blackmail and extortion. They have a large amount of resource support. They have the time, they have the money, they have the hackers. They'll use long-term strategies with a Sun Tzu art of war mentality. They're unrelenting and they're focused. In this video, we talked about organized crime, state-based attacks, and their use of advanced persistent threats, APTs. When I first got into network security back in the 90s, when I was involved in HIPAA, privacy and security, the majority of our attacks were going to be from insiders, and that's really changed. The source of attacks today are more likely to be from the outside, and that's really simply because companies now are doing their due diligence to really perform background checks on their employees, to do credit checks, to investigate the resumes fully, and contact references. But what's interesting is an insider can actually be part of an advanced persistent threat. So one of these organized crime syndicates or one of these groups can actually find somebody and recruit them, maybe somebody who's already in their group that has a clean background, and get them hired in an organization. Or they could use a fake identity and create an entire story for them, and they're actually part of the hacker team. And this is actually something that goes on. So companies must do their due diligence in looking at everybody they hire in the company. Of course, they have to also be aware of disgruntled employees or desperate employees. Individuals may be being blackmailed or coerced. It's not uncommon for a hacker group or a cracker to put a certain type of images of children onto, let's say, a CEO or a CIO's computer. They can pack it and they can unleash it on their system, and then they can turn around and try to blackmail that person or coerce them for some type of ransom. And sometimes normal people that we would never imagine can commit fraud and embezzlement if put in the right situation. So again, we want to do background checks especially on our temporary workers and our contract workers. And let's say in the situation that one of those syndicates does get an insider inside of your organization. They'll follow a common methodology. Once they get in there, they will try for initial compromise. They'll try to get some type of malware on one of the systems, usually through a switch or a wireless access point. They'll try to escalate their privileges, their user privilege to root level or administrative level. They'll continue to do internal reconnaissance, let's say in the data center or the internet data center or the R&D department, the financial department. Then they will do lateral propagation. They'll start compromising other systems with that escalated access, staying on track towards their goal of stealing whatever or destroying whatever, and then their mission's complete. And then they may decide once they've done that, they're going to go ahead and leave the company or quit or just never show up again. It's very common for sabotage services, okay? We've talked about malware as a service. Well, there's organized sabotage services. This could be state-based attack groups or espionage services that are hired by one of your major competitors to steal intellectual property, trade secrets, formulas, the list of your customers, upcoming marketing campaigns, or just the processes you use, maybe in manufacturing. They want to gain a competitive advantage, stealing marketing campaigns and stealing secrets. They may hack your web presence to ruin your reputation, defacing your website, which can affect your goodwill and ongoing relationship with future customers. And the result could be a drop in your stock price, lower revenues, losing customers. In this video, we talked about insiders and competitors, two very valid sources or threat agents and threat actors to deliver malware and exploit your vulnerabilities. It's important to differentiate between the source of threats, the threat agents and the threat actors, and whether they're insiders or outsiders. And sometimes that's not that easy to categorize. For example, let's say I'm in a city like Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I put a really cool looking Green Bay Packer USB key, removable USB drive, and I set it down on a concrete bench right outside of the business or in the parking lot somewhere. So somebody picks it up, takes it inside, and sticks it in their computer. Is that an inside threat or internal, or an external outside threat? Well, technically, it's an external threat that penetrated your physical security and your acceptable use policy. Internal versus external really comes down to where is the attack sourced from. This is also going to affect your security zoning or your domains. To protect against external threats, you want to place all of your public-facing servers, anything that will be accessed by the public, in a DMZ or public access zone. It'll direct your firewall configuration and your VPN deployment, what traffic you're going to allow in and out of your firewall, and what choices do you make for your virtual private networks. You may even use VPN technology inside your campus or inside your corporate office. The edge routers must deploy anti-spoofing mechanisms to make sure that attackers on the outside aren't spoofing inside addresses, and people on the inside who might be launching an attack aren't going to spoof outside addresses. And make sure that your edge routers and firewalls use things like unicast reverse path forwarding to make sure that they're getting traffic from legitimate peers, authenticated and authorized neighbors. All of your inside users must be audited, and you want to add endpoint security for all those different types of network-enabled devices. And that's becoming a longer and longer list every week. Consider all your ingress points and all your egress points, all of your external connections to vendors, to customers, strategic partners, and branch sites. In this video, I talked about internal threats versus external threats. It's also possible to categorize your threats as structured versus unstructured and realize structured threats are planned, they're organized, they're persistent, they're typically multi-phased. They can be internal structured or external structured. They often involve exploit kits, 0 days, modules, purchasing ransomware from the dark web, taking advantage of malware as a service, and other script kiddie solutions. Unstructured threats are accidental. They're non-malicious. They can happen with just benign drive-by web surfing. Maybe the company doesn't have an acceptable use policy and end users are just allowed to use their laptops and provisioned phones and iPads and iPhones for really whatever purposes they want to. Unstructured threats are going to happen through the ordinary usage of email and webmail and the common everyday usage of USB flash drives, removable drives, and personal electronics. In this short video, we compared structured threats to unstructured threats. Now, this topic is really kind of a quick little review of some of the things we've already covered in this course. But remember that a lot of these threat agents and these threat actors, they're very sophisticated. They have tons of resources and they have tons of funding. And this is really no longer just a cottage industry of crackers and hackers who are trying to get notoriety or maybe make a few extra bucks or just need something exciting to do in their lives. These people are very motivated. They're financially motivated. The hacktivists are politically motivated. They have lots of resources. They have access on the dark web to a lot of advanced tools and zero-day exploits that are there for sale. They're sponsored by the state, so a lot of these individuals actually work for their governments or crime syndicates. And they are actually the source of most of the botnets and distributed DOS attacks and ransomware attacks that are happening out there. They're patient and they have a long-term strategy. And as a security practitioner, you're seeing what you're up against. And so it's important that you are able to educate your company or your customers on how critical it is to understand the enemy. In this short video, we discuss the sophistication, resources, and fundings of threat agents and threat actors. If we look at this graph, what we don't see on the horizontal axis at the bottom, that represents time, okay? So the vertical axis on the left shows our threat severity, and the horizontal line, the horizontal axis, is time. And so what we see here is over time, how the intent and motivation of threats has changed. They're becoming increasingly difficult to detect and mitigate. Early on, it was really kind of for notoriety. If you could get a virus named after you, it was a big deal, or your hacker group could get notoriety. It was basic instructions, basic scripting and viruses. Then it moved on to getting fame. Often crackers would hack large companies and then come back to those companies and say, hey, I did you a favor. I found your security holes, so why don't you hire me? Those days are gone. Okay, usually you're not going to get hired by the company. You're going to get prosecuted and possibly thrown in jail or paid large fines. But there's still an element of trying to get fame, especially within your own dark web or deep web, that dark net. You can get your own kind of fame from other groups and other syndicates. But today, the motivation is really financial. It's political with hacktivists. It's organized crime. There's rogue states. And, as I mentioned, this is really World War C, or cyber war. In this video, we'll look at the intent and motivation of threats. One of the challenges we have is that most of this malware, this code, these exploit kits, they're done with open source and they're readily available. And so these exploit kits can be found all over, not over just the dark web, but over the internet in general, the World Wide Web. I'm going to show you a site you can go check out here in a second. But Kali Linux is easy to get. Just go do a web search for that. There's zero-day code stored in the cloud with malware as a service or cybercrime as a service. Most people use the Tor browser. I'm not going to load that up on this machine. The machine I'm using here is my company machine, and it's also on the VPN, so I'm not going to load up the Tor browser, but you're more than welcome to go up and check that out. It's easy to find. There's a black market out there for 0 days and other ransomware exploits that are commonly being deployed. There's a whole underground society of sophisticated hackers that you can get involved with, and law enforcement's always behind the curve. Let me take you to one of many sites, but this is kind of a cool site because if you're just getting started in this, you can use Wireshark as a packet sniffer tool, which I highly recommend that you go grab that. SolarWinds.com has Wireshark. I think you can get a freeware version from there. Let's check out this site. I'm at malware-traffic- analysis.net. You can see the site up there, and I've went ahead and went to this directory 2017. So, you can kind of see where we're at right now. This is April 10th, 2017. And here's, the rig EK. I mentioned that in this course. And so you can see here we're seeing from this IP address and in the matrix ransomware variant. I click on that, and you can get zip archives with a PCAP, and then you can open that up in something like Wireshark, and you can actually see what it looks like. You can see the code. Here's the script, hence script kitty. You can scroll down and see the actual actions and associated domains. And this also kind of gives you a little picture, a flow chart for this infection traffic. The injected EL test script comes from a compromised website. They're using the rig EK kit, and there's your malware payload. So again, if you're just getting started, this is kind of a good idea to actually, in a very benign way, using a packet sniffer like Wireshark to actually see what this malware looks like. Okay, it's time for a little exercise, and let me tell you how this is going to work. I'm going to give you 5 tasks. And what I want you to do is I want you to document these tasks somehow with just a scratch pad and a pen, or grab a word processor. I'm going to give these to you, and then I want you to pause the video and go get the answer. And then come back and then unpause the video, and we'll compare your answers to my answers. So here's your 5 tasks. List 3 prevalent and powerful exploit kits. Name 3 IOC tools. List 4 categories of mitigation or controls. Name the 3 parts of the security triad. And finally, list the 3 classifications of countermeasures. Pause the video and perform the exercise. In the first task, I asked you to list some exploit kits or EKs. So here's rig EK, Neutrino, Magnitude, Sundown, and Hunter. And if you had 3 of any of those, well, you got the right answer. By the way, feel free to go do some web searching on those and learn more about them. Next, I asked for 3 indicators of compromise tools. So if you said NGIPS or SIEM or NetFlow collectors or the OpenIC framework or Cisco Firesite Management Center, you got the correct answer. And by the way, there's a lot more than just these. Next, I asked for 4 categories of mitigation or controls. So there's really 5 main categories: preventative, detective, corrective, recovery, and deterrent. If you said any 4 of these 5, then you got the correct answer. Next, I asked for the 3 parts of the security triad. If you said confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, then you got the answer right. Finally, I asked for the 3 classifications of countermeasures. If you said administrative or managerial, technical, and physical controls, then you got the correct answer. All right, good job.